my frame of reference would be maybe like first century Christianity, where they met in people's houses. That was the church of that. They didn't have church buildings, right? They only just emerged as a separate faith to Judaism. So they'd go to the synagogue on the Saturday, and then they'd meet at people's houses on the Sunday to celebrate the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. They'd have a meetup. But it was decentralized, right? If you go back and look at Paul's letters, like Paul would write letters to the different churches around Asia Minor, and it was this decentralized. It was very similar. And I'm sounding now like I'm making Bitcoin out to be a religion, but I'm not. But I guess in terms of it being this kind of revolution of people with these different ideas to the mainstream meeting up and just in this kind of almost punk way, building something up from the ground up, the grassroots.
Hello, I am Cody Allingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I talk with Dash of the Tokyo Citadel Builders podcast and community. We dive deep into some of the game theory and scenarios that Bitcoin and Hyperbitcoinisation presents, as well as what the broader economic landscape may look like in the future. Just as the internet has become far more than just digital versions of letters and newspapers, Bitcoin may not just be digital money as we know it, but an entirely new paradigm of value transfer and wealth storage that is difficult to fathom while we still exist in the current system. Thus, it is important to broach these ideas and have creative discussions to try and paint a picture of what may come to pass. I also talk with Dash about the role of faith and purpose and meaning more broadly in these trying and changing times. If you have any questions or would like to reach out, my emails are always open, hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. If you would like to support the show, please consider leaving a review or boosting some sats via your favorite podcasting 2.0 platform. Otherwise, on to the show.
Been getting into a lot more of the political stuff the last few months and learning a lot.
How do you find that though, trying to engage with political thought and Bitcoin and sort of balancing those two?
Well, it's not natural for me because I always kind of ignored politics. I like to think of myself as a pragmatic person, so that's why I was focusing on more the technological side of Bitcoin and the privacy, because it seemed that was something I could control. I could actually do, if the things you learn, you can actually put into use in your real life from that day, right? Whereas with political stuff, it's so abstract and it just seems so kind of pointless to study it. But then I just feel like in terms of, I did a lot of soul searching and I thought, well, what are we doing this for? What is this Bitcoin thing about? One of the things that on our recent podcasts that we've done is we did we sort of deconstructed this idea that Bitcoin as a religion. So it's something that both of us had noticed that was cropping up in the Bitcoin circles. And I don't know if you remember the Indonesia Bitcoin conference where they even had a golden calf. There was a video that went viral on Twitter, and they literally had a golden calf at the Indonesian Bitcoin conference, right? It was something like out of the Old Testament. And so that irked both of us. And so we've gone through, okay, well, why is that a problem? And we've broken down something written by, what's her name? I think it's Naomi Hayase. I want to say she's a prominent Bitcoiner. I don't know if you know her. She wrote something called like Bitcoin is the New Messiah, and it was like this. It was the idea of Bitcoin and religion sort of in prose form, and it was just we did a reading on a show and just deconstructed it, and for me it's like that's why I've been getting into politics, because it's like, okay, well now I feel like I'm comfortable with Bitcoin as the tool. I feel like obviously there's more to learn, there's more, and I'll continue to learn those things, but it's like, why am I doing this? Like what is the point in having Bitcoin if the thesis is correct and our purchasing power does increase? What are we going to do with that? Because Bitcoin's just a means to an end. It's just a tool.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Bitcoin as a kind of religious movement, and I had Rigel Walsh on the show a little while back, who's a Kiwi guy who spoke about that at Riga, I believe.
I'm just fact checking myself here, by the way. Yeah. I'm not being rude with
that's
my
okay.
phone.
But we talked about it, and it sort of really had these parallels where the Bitcoiners, I guess you could say in the broad sense, were brought together by the sense that there is a goodness or a righteousness to what they're doing. There's a kind of call to action. There's kind of a way of speaking about Bitcoin stuff, and it certainly can have a lot of those tones of religiousness.
Yeah.
And in many ways, in a secular society, it's like kind of what do you latch onto?
Well, exactly. So, but this is so for me, that's a problem, right? Because I'm and Andy, my co-host, we're believing Christians. And that's among a certain segment of the Western population. That's a dying breed, right? And so for me, well, let me speak for myself. So I believe the human creature is created to worship, and so and we can talk in secular terms. If we've evolved to worship however from whatever framing you like, and so if you don't have, for example, Christianity, or your beliefs rooted in a system like Christianity, something else will emerge which looks like Christianity, but it's different.
A God-shaped hole, right?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, what you're saying though, I mean, it makes sense, and it's sort of. I've been reading or rereading actually a book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which is sort of talking about masculine archetypes and sort of the development of modern man and sort of the challenges around bringing those all together in this modern sort of secular world we live in. And, doing a lot of self-reflection on what that means for me and what my responsibilities are. And in a way, Bitcoin thinking, the principles that go into it really help, provide a way back to that sort of frame of mind. But as you say, a lot of it is also being, I don't want to say hijacked. What's the word we're looking for here? It's being taken up. The pills are being swallowed, and it's this profound experience that maybe hasn't happened before in many people's lives. Do you think?
Oh, maybe. I guess so. I think we've been lucky in the West. We've been privileged, and maybe many of us sort of haven't gone on that hero's journey because we haven't had to.
Have you gone on the hero's journey?
I feel like somewhat. I mean, for myself, I have kids, and that helps. And and I chose to do it on hard mode. I had kids young, and so I had to grow up pretty fast. And being in a how do you say, like a mixed marriage culturally is a big challenge when it comes to raising kids. And so I feel like that forced me to grow up and sort of go through that hero's journey. And then what are we talking about with the hero's journey? Well, I think it's where you sort of descend into the underground a little bit, right? It's like you realize how inadequate you are, and just what a huge task you have ahead of you, and that can make or break a man, right? But it's when you decide, okay, I'm gonna go on the journey, I'm gonna improve, I'll be up to the challenge, and then you spend a certain amount of time in kind of monk mode, whatever you want to call it, where you're really driven and focused and improving yourself, but it's a selfless thing, because it's not just like you're doing it for your own ego. You're doing it because you're the one that your family is relying on, and if you don't do it, it's not just your life you're screwing up their lives too. So there's this huge responsibility that keeps you just on that journey. It doesn't matter how difficult it is, doesn't matter what kind of stuff you have to put up with at work, which is a lot, right? So yeah, I mean, and Bitcoin was just another chapter for me in that, because why, ultimately, why am I doing Bitcoin? I mean, it has to be to that end where I'm protecting my family's wealth in Bitcoin. It's a tool to do that. It gives us optionality in case there's some maybe problems in Japan in the future. Let's say there was some persecution or we had to leave. All these things that could happen that you think about when you have that responsibility. Bitcoin is potentially an answer to that, or it could help with those things. But I feel like, in the West, maybe there's a lot of people who, maybe they don't have kids, for example, and they have comfortable middle class lives, and they've never really been challenged like that, and so maybe they haven't had those dark nights of the soul, and they haven't really been looking for answers of that kind of depth until maybe Bitcoin came along, and then they started to think about it, and maybe it's just an age thing and a generation thing as well, because we're reaching that age where kind of middle age, right, where you start being very keenly aware of your own mortality, and so I guess whether you have kids or not, everyone faces that. So and then people they're looking for those answers, but I feel like with Bitcoin you're looking at the answers in completely the wrong places. Bitcoin is just a tool. It's like it would be like looking at a hammer and saying, okay, we're going to worship the hammer because it helps us build houses, but it's like, no, the hammer just helps you build a house, but then what you're going to do with the house, that's important, and it's nothing to do with the hammer. The hammer just helps you get there. So that's my framing now with Bitcoin. It's just I really want to keep it. I want to keep it as that. It's a tool. It's a really good tool. It's really interesting tech, but it's a means to the end. And then what I want to focus more on now is what's the end. What comes next. What do you use the Bitcoin to do?
Yeah. That's thank you for that, Dash. I mean, reflecting on sort of where I'm at, I think there's certainly a political connection to all of this, which I've been wrapping my brain around a lot really over the last few weeks, when I've seen a few things happen in the Bitcoin space more broadly, a few conversations taking place, which I don't want to say I'm disappointed in them, but I'm very aware of the shortcomings of these conversations and the way that they sort of promote the technology or certain kind of principles, economic principles above all else. And what I'm referring to is libertarianism and Austrian economics, and sort of the way that those two things are seen as sort of an absolute principle that's just kind of been slipped in along with the Bitcoin kind of thing. And ultimately, I mean, humans are political creatures, and we live in communities, and we always have and we always will. And sort of I guess what I'm referring to is that there's this sort of ideology of the free market, of an absolute economic reality, which doesn't take into account kind of the cultural elements of the way society is organized, the kind of human element to it. And I think the debate around those, I almost feel like that's lacking, and I don't know how else to sort of say it. It sort of feels like there's a bit more maturity to bring to that, and this is sort of the political science of Bitcoin, which I often think about, like what lens are we going to look at it through? Because if we reduce it down to technology, then we're no better than the communists in their kind of objectivism of and the objectivity of the way societies should function instead of the way they do function, if that sort of makes sense.
It does. I push back a little bit on your framing as that as a communist thing, because I mean, one of the things that I say that I've been reading a lot of political stuff. I mean, one of the things I've been reading is Curtis Yarvin. I don't know if you know Curtis Yarvin. Very interesting guy, and he writes a lot about essentially, how would you say, like you've got court history.
Yeah, the King's Court.
Yeah.
Kinda, yeah.
Okay, so he brings a perspective which is different. He's I would call him a historian. At least the stuff I've read it's like a political historian, but he will quote a lot of primary sources from, think for example, the Civil War era, the American Rebellion, or as he calls it, but the American Revolution era. He'll even talk about the Stuarts, and he'll go back to British Parliament, the monarchy, the history of the monarchy, and again, he'll quote primary sources of the time, of the side that didn't win whatever conflict, right? And so court history is written by the winners. And so we all have an idea about the American Civil War. It was about freeing the slaves. Lincoln was like a saint. And you read more contemporary accounts from both sides. Thanks to Yarvin, who brings that all together, you start to realize that it was a far more nuanced and complicated thing, and you can apply that to World War II, but one thing I've come to see is our government, well, I'm talking I guess about the US and the UK governments and political systems, not that different to the Russian communists or even the Nazis. Okay, so obviously there are some important differences, but in terms of this idea that you can kind of centrally plan an economy, or a government can kind of redistribute resources, and the answer to all the problems is the government, or is it's the high priests of the day. It's Harvard, it's Oxford, it's what Yarvin calls the cathedral. It's the New York Times. It's that kind of, it's the in crowd, and they get to decide, how much money is going to be printed, and they get to decide who gets that money, and they get to decide whether we all get vaccinated or not, because they went to the right schools, and they speak with the right accents, etc., etc. And I don't like, in that fundamental way. I feel like. What's the difference really between an America and Russia in terms of how the Washington or Moscow tries to control everything in this top-down way? It tries to centrally plan everything, and is arrogant enough to think they can do that. Do you see what I'm getting at? So I've just, I'm not here to say, I'm to pick a side or to say one's better than the other. I would rather live in the West than not, but I mean, this line that we're given, that the West is so superior morally and democracy is such a superior, and we're so different to the Russians or whatever. I don't buy that anymore.
Yeah. How do I put this? So the particular example that comes to mind for me is the conversation happening around Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, and there's no personal income tax. There's sort of this kind of purely economic freedom in the sense that you're not being taxed as heavily as many other places. And I see conversations that somehow trumps the ability to innovate on governance and the ability to kind of misbehave at a low level. And what I mean by that, this kind of blind faith in property rights, for example, that doesn't really take into account the fact that most teenagers are going to have a period where they're a bit rebellious and they want to break stuff, and chopping off a hand for doing that, or kind of, the punishment needs to be in proportion to the crime. And I think that there's this kind of messy consensus which comes about, and certainly from New Zealand I see that, where, at a low level it is messy and there's a lot of failings and it's very slow. However, it still kind of works, and it enables this kind of humanism to emerge, whereas sort of some of these purely economic kind of systems approaches to organizing they still feel very centralized in their kind of thought process that, we're all just going to be obedient citizens and economic actors. And it doesn't take into account that there's always going to be the down and out artist, or the kind of rebellious kid trying to do something. And I guess what I'm interested in is how you have conversations that take all of that into account in a very humanistic way, if that sort of makes sense. So it's sort of not holding these places up on a pedestal.
No, it totally does. I push back on, so humanism has become a little bit of a dirty word for me.
Okay.
Because for a couple of reasons, but I kind of tie in humanism with sciencism in this trend that I've seen in the quote unquote cathedral, the establishment, the Western intelligentsia, if you like, where there's this kind of arrogant presumption that through human ingenuity we can do anything, and that humans are fundamentally and amazing and good.
An enlightenment kind of approach to it.
Yeah, right.
We can build anything.
Yeah,
put our minds to it.
Yeah, and I see that as a little bit hubristic, and then I think about, and again, it comes back to maybe my, reconnecting with my Christian faith. But for example, in the Bible, you have the Tower of Babel story, which I think is great, and to me, you can interpret that story in many different ways, maybe, but for me, it's a tale of human hubris. It's this tale as old as time, where people think they can, through their own human ingenuity and engineering, build a tower to heaven, which is maybe a metaphor for a utopia on Earth, right? And it all falls apart, and they end up speaking different languages. in the story, if you recall it. But I feel like that plays out throughout history again and again and again. And the problem with humanism is it puts the human at the center. It's kind of this human worship, and you fall into hubris, and you also risk being naive, right? Because the human has a lot of depth, and yes, we can reach for the stars, but I feel like human evil and human corruption reaches all the way down to hell at the same time, right? So you have both of those in the human, and in all of us, right? There's that light and dark, and I feel like in the West there's a tendency to downplay that capacity for evil, or project it just entirely onto our enemies, quote unquote enemies, right? Like it's Putin's evil, but we're not. We're good, right? We're democratic, and so yeah. For those reasons, I'm really wary of humanism, and any time I hear that kind of and that is essentially the religion of the West now as well. And this is another one of Yarvin's ideas. I mean, he calls it universalism, but it's this idea that essentially humanism stroke universalism is a non-theistic evolution of Christianity. And it sounds crazy, a non-theistic Christianity, but there's a lot of assumptions people make in the West about what is right and wrong, and which actually is grounded in the Christian tradition. Because you can make the argument, and you can go back and you can read. Obviously, the likes of Dostoevsky and Nietzsche saw this problem a couple of hundred years ago, and you can go back and you can read those books and see that play out in there. But I mean, simply speaking, we have this foundation to our culture, which is Christianity, and through the process of the Enlightenment and through science, because the scientists becoming the high priests of our time, people stop believing in the supernatural elements of Christianity. This even goes back to like Tolstoy, for example. He rewrote the Gospels, and he became obsessed with Christianity in the latter period of his life, but he rewrote the Gospels and took out all the supernatural stuff, and he sort of reduced the Gospels and Jesus to this kind of how would you say, this ethical teacher, and this I think is what is the dominant evolved, if you want to call it, like if you want to talk in Richard Dawkins terms, it's like it's the meme, it's the mimetic thing where Christianity has evolved to be non-theistic now. So you don't have to believe in the miracles or anything like that, but we believe in the ethics, and then we believe in Jesus was kind of a cool guy. He's like a hippie who told us all to love each other, etc., right? So that is not only in the Church of England, not only in the Catholic Church. They like right up to the hierarchy in those institutions. They kind of have, that's how they see the faith, and that's kind of tacitly just kind of, I think, accepted by the majority of at least the quote unquote intelligentsia, the media types, etc., university educated types in the West. But it's dangerous because you've kind of taken the keystone away from the whole belief system, and you've tried to keep the good parts and just flush away the kind of difficult parts to contend with. But there was a reason that keystone was there, and the people who developed that system developed it in far more trying times than we currently live in. Thanks to things like us discovering fossil fuels and having access to so much energy now. It made our lives a lot easier. We don't have to labor in fields anymore. We live lives which are so much more comfortable than our ancestors, but that isn't guaranteed to last forever. And there's signs indeed that is coming to an end, right? And we're heading into potentially more difficult times from rocky waters, and that is when people are going to get tested with this lightweight, non-theistic Christianity, which has become the dominant, I would say, religion of the West. So I don't know. I'm ranting a little bit here, but I don't know how that relates to Bitcoin. But I guess it relates in the sense that I think people are sensing that we're going into these difficult times, these choppy waters, and they're kind of panicking a little bit. People are getting a little bit scared with things like global warming and the potential financial collapse, etc. And I think the internet kind of intensifies this because we're all aware that things aren't going great. And so maybe people are scrambling for meaning in that sense as well. And one of the things they're clinging to is Bitcoin and thinking Bitcoin's going to save them. But, Bitcoin's going to maybe save your purchasing power, but that's all. And then beyond that, in terms of saving your own soul, or whatever you want to say in a secular sense, saving your own mental health, that's a completely different story.
Yeah, I often think that we are living in a post-truth society, and this has been a big theme for me to explore through my work, through my creative work. I'm very lucky to have another vehicle, not just this show, but also my creative work allows me to sort of interface with that, that muse of thought and kind of extract and give back to it. And I often think, man, you can't trust anything except what's on your Bitcoin node and what it tells you, because the news and everything is absolutely corrupted, and it does feel a bit biblical in a way. We've just kind of got this mass, what would you call it? It's not even amnesia, but it's just kind of psychosis of everything, and it's like we're uber connected. Our media is telling us one thing, but the truth is something else. And there also feels like it's been going on for a while and sort of slowly been ramping up. And even just sort of the mode of living, often, we all talk about sort of fiat living and what fiat kind of means, but it really does sort of start to become obvious in many parts of our lives how empty and unfulfilling it is. And with this kind of promise just on the horizon of sort of, we will have an abundance and sort of this great life, but then at the same time, that's gone away. We've been given this kind of doomsday millenarianism kind of end of times kind of prophecy as well, and it's sort of like we're being swung between the two: the promise of mammon and the also this kind of looming sword of Damocles of global warming or the end. I mean, it can be quite confusing spiritually, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably archetypal, right? In that there's always an Armageddon and there's always a heaven dichotomy, right? In that would be expressed in the Christian thinking, it would be described in those terms. In the secular, in the humanist or universalist sense, it seems to be, on one hand, you've got the kind of Star Trek of the 60s or even Next Generation of the 90s, if you remember that show, but where that was the kind of utopia, right? That was the heaven where we would engineer our way out of all these problems. We'd get off this rock, we'd go out there and explore in the universe. And then, on the other hand, you've got the global warming thing, which is the Armageddon. And it's linked to sin, right? Because it's us that's, when you throw out a plastic bottle, you're the one that's causing the
consumption, right?
Yeah, it's linked to sin. So it's and Curtis Yarvin thinks that this is linked to Calvinism. It's fascinating. So if you look at where this comes from, a lot of it comes from New England, or New York, like East Coast America, which was puritanical, right? Established by puritanicals, Calvinists. So he thinks it's like this evolution of it's the latest evolution of the Puritans, which is a scary thought. But I think, but I don't think it's necessarily a new thing, because if you go back to the 60s, people were terrified of nuclear Armageddon, right? That was, you've always got that existential despair or angst or whatever in any generation. I'm sure that's there. But to think that the latest manifestation of it in the West is somehow, there is this assumption, and it's hilarious. Yarvin points it out that he deconstructs some of Richard Dawkins' writings, and Dawkins has this kind of arrogance where everyone else is kind of superstitious and unscientific, but he's on the side of the truth and rationality, and And yet he talks about the Dawkins uses the word zeitgeist in his writings to refer to this gradual direction of history whereby things are going in the right direction. Things are getting better morally and in all sorts of ways. And there's just this tacit assumption that Dawkins has in this kind of, it's almost like a manifest destiny kind of way of thinking, but it's not scientific, right? Why if you think about it rationally, why would history always go in a good direction?
Well, it's necessarily metaphysical. There is no there's no formula or schematic for that. It is the hand of fate and the billiard boards or the billiard balls of fate, if on one hand, but it could also be the guided direction of history as well. And so you kind of get given these two things. It's like the absolute randomness and chaos of atoms and molecules, or some sort of divine plan, both of which have equally kind of terrifying, but also a certain sense of relief on one of them, I would imagine, which is that there is a plan for it all. Because if it is all just chaos and matter and energy floating around, bouncing around, it sort of gives this great sense of unease that maybe there's no purpose to any of it. And you start working through these kind of levels of thinking, and eventually it can be quite overwhelming to
actually absolutely
realize what's it all about. I mean, I had a little moment yesterday. I was out at Enoshima Island, just sitting there on the rocks watching the waves and sort of feeling it all happen. And you see everyone kind of come in and take photos and then leave. And I just sat there for about half an hour watching the waves and the people and how they both seem to sort of wash over the land. It's all temporary. Basho saw this hundreds of years ago. Others have seen all of this come and go, and they've all left this earthly plane. And I found that moment, and there's this great sense of kind of the oneness and the completeness of it all. And it's sort of taking a step away from that and not trying to Instagram it was kind of my first step. And so I think in a way, a lot of these challenges we're facing come from this sort of hyper-connected world we live in. And that's sort of, in a way, Bitcoin starts to help with that as a tool, though, because it gives you a reference for truth in the sense that, the money and the governance and all of that is full of shit, but you can at least be sure about your money. And then with some of the associated technology and some of the kind of thought that's sort of surrounding and wrapping Bitcoin, you start being able to curate and understand what's going on, maybe politically or locally, at least in your own community, with some of the decentralized media technology and things like Nostra. So there's kind of this scaffold effect where we're trying to rebuild kind of really from the beginning all of these systems again. It doesn't seem like it would be as easy to just, it'd be a nice thought to think we could just move over into take what we've got and move it into this new paradigm of Bitcoin. But it really feels like we're going to have to rebuild everything, all of these systems. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Before getting into that, I just wanted to comment on your the people being like waves, which was interesting that you said that. The one description of why we're here that I heard is scientific that made the most sense to me was it was this really I've never heard anyone really talk about this lecture. It was very, very smart guy, actually a Kiwi that I know who shared this lecture with me. Very obscure thing, but it was someone who was arguing that essentially you would expect intelligent life to emerge in a system because it was a means of distributing heat, like entropy, essentially, so. That kind of made sense, and it's like on some level of reality, we only exist to facilitate this, dissipation of heat.
Yeah. Von Neumann machines just taking it around different parts of the world, different parts of the galaxy. But I mean, like with computer science, I think that reality has a number of layers of abstraction, right? So if you consider computing, it's all electrical charge in a microchip, right? Whether it's a 0 or a 1, at some level of reality that's represented by electrons.
on another, you got a slightly higher level of abstraction, it's assembly language, and a slightly higher, maybe it's C, slightly higher than that, maybe you're talking about the application layer, or the operating system, right? Then the application, then it's then it's what you're seeing on the screen. At each level, you've got, it's essentially the same thing, but it's just, it's just different level of abstraction, right? And at each level, there's a different kind of meaning which you can project onto it. And I think probably life is something similar to that. But to get to your point about your question about, you were talking about Bitcoin as a sort of grounding, and would we have to build out new systems completely on top of that, or could we? So I guess implied when your question was, could we modify existing systems, or do we have to completely rebuild things?
So we've got a few different things going on here. I guess what I'm getting at is, I'm sitting there on this rock, feeling the rock and watching the ocean and realizing that we've got this mass psychosis of late stage fear, late stage capitalism, a huge lot of unknowns for a lot of people, a huge lot of fear and uncertainty around the world. Is it simply a case of an ETF is going to fix this? Is it a case that we're just going to be able to roll into a new system, or is there some more larger kind of revolution, spiritual or cultural or technological, that is going to be required to really usher in this new age? The one that comes to mind is the Industrial Revolution. But how do you see the transition to a Bitcoin world?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a massive question. So first, the ETF. Let's address that. So
the E word.
And I think the ETF is absolutely absurd. I guess Steelman it's like a layer 2 for suits. That's the best description I've seen of it. It's a custodial layer 2 for suits. They can get price exposure. In that sense, I guess it kind of makes sense, but it's so antithetical to the what I see as the one and only use case of Bitcoin. The only reason it really exists is as to be a censor and seizure resistant form of property, which is digital, native to the internet. So you can own it and nobody needs to know that. You can transact and nobody needs to know that. Nobody can stop that. You could pick up your sticks and leave, cross borders, take all of your wealth with you. But essential to that is that you understand public-private key pair cryptography, right? So you, to the level at least, you need to know how to self-custody, to keep a secret, 12 words. And that's not that difficult, but it is difficult, and it's not exactly intuitive. And it's kind of scary. So it's a leap of faith, right? But if you're not doing that, to me, there's absolutely no point in Bitcoin. It's absurd to think you own price exposure to this thing. Well, anyone who's thinking of buying an ETF for that reason, I would say, well, just buy the S&P 500. It's far better. The S&P 500 is number go up tech. Think about it. All the regulation around the stock market is designed to pump the damn price. I mean, governments are almost explicit now in this. They think they have a mandate to pump the stock market. I mean, Trump was very explicit about this, right? I mean, the only difference between Trump and Biden and the establishment really is that Trump was actually willing to say the things that you're not supposed to say. I mean, his policies aren't that different. If you think about Biden's policy, I mean, how many policies has Biden overturned or from the Trump era? So, they have things like circuit breakers. What's that? What's the point of the circuit breaker?
Well, I guess we talk about the ETF, and I mean, in the sense, though, that it is a legacy kind of vehicle for this new thing called Bitcoin. And I'm in between sort of two worlds here, where I think, on one hand, it just sort of rolls out nice and easy, and it's this thing that slowly, hegemonically kind of becomes dominant. On the other hand, though, I also see, the kind of doomsday of massive nation state failures, financial collapse, and then that's the only thing left. And kind of between those two worlds, there's this great chasm of sort of discussion, and I kind of call it Bitcoinism, sort of like what all of that means. And that's where I think there's a lot to kind of, there's a lot of things to bring into that, because purely market forces and a kind of free market approach to it means, are we just going to have something similar to a kind of a Hayek or a Rothbardian kind of vision of sound money, and we just live our lives and be productive workers? Or is there necessarily some other stuff that happens in there, similar to the way we didn't just go into the Industrial Revolution and continue the way things were, but with machines, it really changed society, and it was this kind of yin and yang into a new way of being. And at the same time, that brought in this kind of Nietzschean argument around the death of God and kind of the role of spirituality and all of that, which kind of connects with what we were talking about before. So I guess, how do we even, before we talk about what's going to happen, how do we even begin to talk about what is in this gap, in this gaping hole in the future, that we can sort of maybe cast our eyes towards, let's bust out our crystal ball and have a think about it,
So So about the gap. So are you talking about the gap between the legacy financial world and and this new thing that's emerging? Is that the gap you're talking about?
Yeah, that. And we kind of know what the thing on the other side is. We've got hyperbitcoinization, right? And we can theorize around what that looks like.
Well, should we get into that?
Okay.
Well, so I don't foresee a future of hyperbitcoinization where I'm just going into 7-Eleven and I'm buying a coffee with sats. And do we differ on that?
So what you just said, though, is like, I guess what I'm getting at is not what it's going to be, but how do we talk about it? Because what you're talking about is 7-Eleven. What does that even mean? What does it mean to buy stuff from a convenience store? Is that not a fiat institution of convenience? For example. What is the lens?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Like, what is the lens that we look at for even having a debate or a? Yeah.
So let me define for me, people say, well, what do you see? What does Bitcoin look like if it succeeds? I guess that's a good question, because some people say, well, it's hyper-Bitcoinization. What does that mean? It means, we don't use fiat anymore. We're just using Bitcoin. I don't see that ever happening, actually. Maybe it'll be a base. It'll be the base of the financial system, where people will be kind of using an abstraction on top of Bitcoin. I mean, that would make sense. But Bitcoin has scaling issues, which we all know about. Lightning has scaling issues related to the base layer scaling issues. There's the knowledge gap, and there's the fact that most people just don't want to mess around with Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, I guess the way. So this is where I'm bringing it back to sort of some of this socialist international kind of old school communist rhetoric, which is that somehow the proletariat will just wake up and start moving toward. I agree with you, man. I don't think it just happens. I think it lives within hierarchies of knowledge, and it lives within systems of almost sort of technocratic, skill sets, being able to manage private keys. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it is kind of magical in a way, in the same degree that the internet would have seemed magical to someone in the 50s, right? Having this magic money that you can just memorize, that's quite a profound concept, and there's a reason why a lot of people don't get it. And so how do we have conversations around kind of the anthropology of the future of a Bitcoin world? Like, how do we draw it out? Because it certainly won't look like we just go into a convenience store and spend sats. It's almost like, do we have a decentralization of these ways of being, where you've got people like you and I, maybe who are on a Bitcoin standard. You've got people who are locked away in the fiat standard. You know what I mean?
I think so, yeah. So I think, if anything, you may replace one elite with another. Well, this is maybe what we're seeing, right? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the history of the world is this, essentially, where this kind of Marxist idea that the proletariat's going to rise up, and was it in 1984 when Winston was having his conversation with one of his conversations with O'Brien, is it, from the party, and Winston said hope is with the proles, and O'Brien sort of dismissed that, laughed at him. Yeah, I mean, I completely with O'Brien on this one. I don't think, the proles, and I don't think we'll ever see a world of complete equity where, so
of course not.
Well, I'll never, be careful of saying never, but 99.99% sure that'll never happen. So what will happen then? So I think maybe the current elite will adopt Bitcoin from within the elite. You would have thought people would get it and would use it to further their own interests. Some kind of Caesar figure could emerge in the US who rides Trump. People worried about Trump being a Caesar, but he doesn't get Bitcoin. He's an idiot, right? So probably not him.
Well, you talk about Kevin Yarvin, right?
Curtis Yarvin, yeah.
Sorry, Curtis. You talk about Curtis Yarvin and this kind of counterfactual approach to history, and I think that's sort of what I'm getting at here is like, can we learn from some of these examples where, the internet maybe is a good one to look at recently. How did that roll out and how did that emerge, and how did it implicitly change the thing that existed and the power structures that existed previously as it went? It didn't just happen in a vacuum, and with something much more fundamental like money, it kind of changes itself and it changes everything around it, and it's this very emergent effect. And I guess I sort of look for sophistication in these arguments and sort of an analysis, and the best that I see is basically free market analysis, which is like, well, Bitcoin wins because economics. Is that purely true? Is that paradigm still rooted in 20th century scales of economy, commercial, capitalism, these kinds of systems that are in place? Is that the end game of everything? Does that sort of make sense? Like,
yeah. Well, again, what does it mean for Bitcoin to win, right? So does it mean it becomes the reserve asset? Does it mean the central banks hold Bitcoin? Is that what Bitcoin winning means? Does it mean that it's undeniable that Bitcoin is it's the pristine, was it Raul Rugpal used to say, pristine collateral or whatever? Everyone just has to admit that Bitcoin is the pristine collateral.
Well, coming back to some of these Christian things you're talking about. So, for example, and I'm just going to throw it out there as an idea. Does Bitcoin winning mean that humans can now have the freedom to devote themselves to God, for example, as one just over here, real left field hypothetical, and take away some of these economic imperatives? Because what was the economics of the pyramids? What was the economics of the Tower of Babel? The Tower of Babylon. What are these? What are these organizing systems? And I mean, this is where you get into the communist utopia, where you're like, well, we can be beyond money, and people get their backs up at that. But I think there really is a space for discussion.
Yeah, again, I don't see that as communist. I mean, that if you look at the Star Trek world, they didn't have money, right? So I think getting to this, what do they call that when there's plenty? There's a word for that, right? Like post scarcity. Yeah, that's it. So does it help us to get to post scarcity? Is that the question? And then we can focus ourselves entirely on the arts and philosophy and religion.
I don't have any opinions on any of this. What I'm, I guess, curious about, and I mean, it's all for the sake of argument, but what I'm curious about is what methods can we deploy to discuss these kinds of things? Because I guess I don't stand up and say, look, this is what I think is going to happen, because I don't know, right? But I'm really interested in the practice of having these discussions, and I think that's where I see deficiencies in the arguments that resort to basically 20th century manufacturing capitalism, these kinds of systems which only have existed for the last several hundred years. Prior to that, there were different priorities, and this loops back into the spiritual argument, because there's a reason that you could spend all this money spend all these resources and effectively money to build a cathedral. It wasn't a productive enterprise in the sense that a factory is, but it was this kind of factory of faith, and it was this different kind of vector on which you organize.
It's amazing, isn't it? And that is the question to, I mean, that fascinates me to think what motivated people, especially the ones who've laid the first bricks, because they knew they would never see the end result. It is the question to ask, because there's something there, right? There's something, and like you say, it's completely beyond rational.
And I think that's where I get to, where I think if we run out the economic argument, I think it works in a lot of cases, in our day-to-day life. And right now, there is economics here, but there's also a bigger thing. Yeah. And how does that just whole thing, we don't know what it is, it's a bit of a black box, but how does that all work with Bitcoin? How,
So I think that what happens is, if the thesis if it's correct that Bitcoin is going to be this pristine collateral, it means that people who adopt Bitcoin early are going to, and they manage to hold on to it, are going to have a lot of power in the future. And then those people can then decide what they want to do with that power. And so you'll have a new elite emerge, which, if you look at, Renaissance or something like that, and what did the elite spend their money on? It was art, or it was cathedrals, or what have you. Compare that to what the Carnegie era, the post-industrial revolution, where it was more libraries and universities, and so what is this emergent elite of Bitcoiners going to prioritize? What are they going to patronize? I would say would be a clue, right, into what direction things are going to go. Will there be a uniformity? Will there be is there a kind of Bitcoiner archetypal type, or will there be a coalescence of that economic power amongst Bitcoiners that would become kind of a movement in the world?
And that's why I wonder if there are certain traits that emerge. I mean, generally speaking, I think there are commonalities we can find between Bitcoiners. Not all of them, but certainly there are some cultural memes, and they're there, and they are memes for a reason. Are those things that are going to transition sort of almost in the kind of Protestant kind of way? You had kind of hard work and doing the labor. Are those kind of values that maybe
proof of work,
the proof of work, things like privacy, decentralization, are these values going to transmit through time as the Bitcoiners who maybe don't have those values sell out, or they sort of fall away from the system? So it's almost the opposite of mass adoption. It's like it gets harder and harder for the Bitcoiners to exist as the pressure clamps down.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Well, I think, and Matt Odell says, it always stuck with me, that Bitcoin is a game of survival. And like many things, he manages to distill a lot of meaning down into, like stay humble, stack sats is one. But I think Bitcoin is a game of survival is more, it behooves you to meditate on that, because to me, just because you have Bitcoin today doesn't mean you're going to have Bitcoin tomorrow. And a lot of people are going to give into the siren call of number go up and sell for pieces of paper. And a lot of people are going to lose their Bitcoin through carelessness, or not having spent enough time securing. A lot of people are going to have it seized, right? So yeah, I mean, so the selection is going to be, I think, as you say, I think you alluded to there, the selection pressure is going to increase, and what kind of Bitcoiner is going to survive on the other side? I would imagine it was the paranoid, the powerful, maybe the well-connected. They're already powerful.
Yeah, well, I mean, on that note, though, I mean, I think there is something to be said about the way one lives their daily life, and living in paranoia, living in fear. I feel like that is it's a way of existing that maybe breeds itself, in the sense that you become the thing that you fear. Like
Gollum in Lord of the Rings, where I always think of him with when he's turns himself into a monster. Yeah,
and so I mean, there's certainly some allegories around that we can look at. I mean, is it possible that more and more people get Bitcoin, but they get it at a very what would you call it? So, something like the ETF, something like a custodial Lightning wallet, where it feels like you've got Bitcoin, but you don't really have Bitcoin, because when push comes to shove, it gets turned off. And so is one scenario, and I guess ultimately what I'm really interested in is laying out all these different scenarios, all of these different kind of war games for what it looks like, and not sort of putting my ego into any one of them, but actually saying, well, look, these are the range of sort of possibilities that we've been able to broach. Is one of them that there's less and less Bitcoiners over time as they kind of select themselves out, and then they can't get back in. Because if there's no ramps to get into Bitcoin, no one's going to be wanting to spend any Bitcoin. They're just hodling through the hard times. Is it going to be harder and harder to keep that? And then eventually you pass through that great filter, and then that becomes the new elite that managed to sort of weather the storm.
Maybe. As
one option,
Maybe. I mean, the other thing to ask yourself, I guess, is how many... So I can see that number of individuals who hold Bitcoin decrease, maybe, or that consolidate. But will we start seeing more... Like a MicroStrategy is an example today of an institution that holds Bitcoin, has a lot of Bitcoin, right? The US government has a. Do
they really have Bitcoin though? Because they're using Coinbase custodial solutions, right?
Good point.
I don't know. I mean, that just says
Yeah, good point. No, I don't think they do. They have a claim on Bitcoin, which is permissioned. So, but yeah, good point. But so was it the Indonesian government recently who were found to be mining it, or there was some country, right? So I mean, there are going to be institutions, even nation states. I mean, El Salvador, I guess, owns Bitcoin, right? So will we start seeing more organizations as economic actors in the Bitcoin ecosystem?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the counterpoint to all of this, which I think there is an undertone of sort of pessimism to this, but the other side of it is just like the internet, and it's all good, and everyone gets on board and is happily ever after. And I mean, that's two sort of pathways, right? And it's sort of almost biblical in the sense, there's the path of cooperation and love thy neighbor and just sort of let it be, and then there's the pathway of the tyrant and the despot and this kind of great evil that descends. And I don't know, I mean, how do you even talk about those two ends of the spectrum? What are the nuances? I mean, I don't know, but sort of the thought experiment,
So yeah, I'd push back a little bit on the despot as evil idea. Okay. That I know we live in that culture where democracy's held up as the highest good, or it's a good. It's just assumed, right? And then a quote unquote dictatorship is seen as evil. There's that dichotomy in the West. Now there can be benevolent dictator, right? So if you mentioned. Well, you mentioned Dubai, I think, in a negative sense, but a lot of people talk about Dubai in a positive sense, or Singapore. Maybe they are very strict on crime, but maybe there's certain people within those countries who appreciate that.
So if correct me if I'm wrong, so you're saying that there's a limit, is there a limit to the evil of the individual, and is the evil that's possible within a system unlimited? Is that sort of what we're getting at here?
I think there's no limit to human evil at the individual or the institutional level, I would say.
Okay. Because I think, you're right. I mean, despot, dictator, I mean, it's a word we throw out there, but I mean, a lot of evil was perpetrated from these systems, these ministries, these governments, which are effectively, organisms of their own. People come in and out, but the thing exists with
like a beehive.
It's a hive mentality, and we saw that obviously most recently with COVID and the thing, all that entails. Perhaps there were key people who made decisions, but the kind of the collective unconscious of that organism was able to project evil onto the world.
And with good intentions, as evil often is, right? That's the worst kind, actually.
Yes.
Evil exists in I would say in every human heart, and then and that can manifest itself in really, really harmful, really terrible ways, unimaginable ways, right? And COVID was one example of that. I feel like that was a warning shot. Like, it could have been a lot worse, but it was kind of depressing to see how many people went along with it, and I'll call them COVIDians. They almost adopted COVID as a religion, which is really, I would say, sad more than anything from my point of view. Some people really seem to put their identity into wearing masks and getting vaxxed, and you even had people getting tattoos, right, of their favorite Moderna versus Pfizer. So that was depressing. That was a little sad. On the other hand, there's been a lot of people who I feel sort of got the red pill during that period, and have kind of decided to do something about it, right, and join movements like the Bitcoin movement.
Do you think the role of discussion, discourse, just having a chat over a beer has become more and more relevant and more prominent post-COVID? I mean, do you see that with, Bitcoin, or just in any kind of conversation, the re-emergence of this kind of conversation culture? Conversation
is in people who don't necessarily, people are different sides of an argument.
Yeah.
So like a liberal and a Democrat and a Republican, for example, or in terms of healing that divide, you mean, or just in?
So I think step one is just people having conversations, maybe amongst people with aligned ideas. Maybe a stretch goal would be conversations across the divide, which I don't see so much of. But certainly I feel like there's been a re-emergence of people like you and I talking like this.
Right.
And it didn't feel like that was happening a few years ago, at least not,
That's true.
Not around me.
Yeah. I think podcasts have really helped with that. I mean, it's was it Peterson Jordan Peterson who called it a Gutenberg revolution, the podcast, and he made some good points, because he said, not everyone can read, and the Gutenberg revolution was about democratization of information, but that was accessible actually at that point only to people who read Latin, and but with podcasts, everybody can listen. And what we've seen from the success of the likes of Joe Rogan is people really like long-form conversations. Lots of people do.
Well, it's also a different mode of discussion because it's spoken, it's more real. You're not outlining these paragraph type answers. You're trying to find truth together.
Yeah.
And I think that's exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be nice and hopeful to see that grow a little bit further into a mainstream place where
would it? I think they'll ruin it.
You reckon?
I think this mainstream will ruin it. I mean, have you ever heard any mainstream podcasts? They're terrible.
They're difficult to listen to.
Yeah.
They always have. I can always tell straight away when they've got like this kind of little jazzy intro.
When the jazzy intro is a big red flag.
And it's like we used to have this ad. This TV ad in New Zealand for this it was called Ajax spray and wipe, and it was like you spray and clean the table, and it was like this they were all like strung out and like having to clean up a really messy house, and it was just this like the tension in the music.
There's something commercial about that. There's something fake, or what is it? What's the word I'm looking for?
It's like running around in a busy Tokyo train station trying to find something, and it's like this kind of nightmare situation. Whereas slowing it down. But can we bring that slow growth back into broader discussions
to the mainstream? So I guess, because I remember growing up, you would look to the likes of the BBC and let's say the FT newspaper as sources of, I guess they were sane and they were worth listening to. They kind of set the tone of the conversation. You could trust them. Right?
We can't trust them anymore.
Absolutely not. And maybe couldn't back then, and maybe that's just because there was no alternatives and we were more naive. I don't know. But I guess your question, could we get back to that early 90s kind of...
Well, I go back further. Can we go... this is pre-Christian, but how do we go back to Socratic dialogue? How do we go back to the Greeks and the city-states and the forums and the way of discussing things?
Wasn't that always an elite pursuit though, even back then?
Yeah, I guess so. But it was still accessible. It was out in the street. It wasn't in the high tower. And we're in an old office building here in Tokyo doing this thing. We don't have a studio. We don't have, any high-tech green screens or anything.
Don't need it.
And even take the gear away, all we need is a place to sit and a couple of beers.
An iPhone or Pixel with graphene on it. Little shout out to the privacy minded.
And I think I guess what I'm getting at is I feel like within the discussions I've been privileged to have and very thankful, it almost feels like we're going back to this kind of Royal Society kind of thing. But that actually, the negative to that is we're coming back to your humanism here, because it's an enlightenment idea that we can somehow talk our way out of it.
Maybe, but I would think my frame of reference would be maybe like first century Christianity, where they met in people's houses. That was the church of that. They didn't have church buildings, right? They only just emerged as a separate faith to Judaism. So they'd go to the synagogue on the Saturday, and then they'd meet at people's houses on the Sunday to celebrate the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper.
They'd have a meet-up.
They'd have a meetup, but it was decentralized, right? Yeah. If you go back and look at Paul's letters, like Paul would write letters to the different churches around Asia Minor, and it was this decentralized. It was very similar, and I'm sounding now like I'm making Bitcoin out to be a religion, but I'm not. But I guess in terms of it being this kind of revolution of people with these different ideas to the mainstream meeting up, and just in this kind of almost punk way, building something up from the ground up, the grassroots. In that sense, what we're doing is similar to that, and that can be a good thing. I mean, when was the last time that happened? So, when was the last? You mentioned what was the one you mentioned? The
Industrial Revolution.
Was it? So, because I know I haven't studied this in depth, but I know they used to meet in cafes in Paris or whatever, and they'd have these discussions. Was that the last time we had this kind of thing?
I think so, because you had the Scottish Enlightenment, you had Industrial Revolution, these guys, and in a lot of cases they were an elite. They had free time, James Clerk Maxwell, all these guys were able to just mess around and build telescopes and build experiments and things, and James Watt and all of these kind of great figures in that period had the free time to kind of basically fuck around.
What gave them that free time? Was that the wealth from the Industrial Revolution?
Well, this would have been in some cases prior to the Industrial Revolution. So perhaps, I'd have to look into it, but I imagine they were aristocracy.
Right, okay. They own land.
And so they had the free time to mess around. And there was a moment, and then at a later date you had the salon culture emerge.
Oh, that's the one, the salon culture.
And that was sort of the emergence of Nietzsche and sort of philosophy and kind of these kind of ideas. It was a bit later on, but it was like you had a place where people could meet in real life and have discussions that were quite deep, extended. There were people coming in and out of it. It was a free market for ideas, I guess. And it feels like in many ways that's what we're going through at the
Interesting.
moment.
And could well be. And I guess the sort of books that emerge from that movement, I'm not that familiar with it. Maybe you mentioned Nietzsche, but so I guess we're seeing that in Bitcoin with not only podcasts, but we also have our own body of literature, right? I don't know. It's a question. Would you say that that's the case?
There's certainly. I think the platform. Books are kind of a legacy medium now. I think the platform is Twitter. Or X.
Don't say that. Or not even on it.
Or something like Stacking News or Nostra or one of these. Basically it's online. It's mimetic. The books are the kind of long format, but the actual day-to-day stay humble, stack sats.
Yeah.
That encompasses mimetically so much.
Yeah, it does.
And you read the book later, but you get that little piece at the beginning. And
not your keys, not your Bitcoin, etc.
Yeah. And so that is how this movement is being disseminated. And I wonder, I'd have to do I'd have to look into it, but how were these ideas originally disseminated at these different points in time, these junctures of human thought? Were they tombs of knowledge, or were they...
There must have been memes as well, right? Like there was
pithy kind of little sound bites.
There must have been
that you overheard in a cafe somewhere, or that you were talking about it in the Royal Society, and you think, oh fuck, that's a good idea. I'm going to go home and mull over it. And it sort of encodes a lot of deeper meaning into the idea. And especially the prerequisite, though, is that you need people who are willing to think about things. And I think that was that's what we have now. We've got people who because it's easy to say no and say, look, I'm not interested in Bitcoin. But if you've got someone who says, okay, well, you honestly tell me about it, and then I'll go and do my own research, that person's going to find the answer. But it requires that sort of intellectual openness, kind of curiosity. And I think we're beginning to have that now. We're beginning to see more and more people say, okay, cool, I'll think about it. And then they come at it with a different angle, a different lens. And then they add to the body of work, this kind of proof of work collectively that we've developed.
Yeah. I think, for me, Bitcoin is ludicrous. It's a computer science experiment. It's 15 years old. It's so absurd to think of putting your money in this thing, for me. It could be zero. There could be a bug in the code that knocks 90% off the value tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I think for me, what made me embrace Bitcoin, I guess, as the answer was just realizing how much worse the actual legacy financial system was. I think that is where most people are coming to Bitcoin. I think unless you think, the clown world meme,
Yeah.
unless you see the current institutions as clown world, why would you mess around with something as dangerous and experimental and unprecedented as Bitcoin? And so I read the FT here today before I came, and I thought those guys were coming around to Bitcoin. There was like two, I think it was the weekend FT, I read the Monday, there was like 2 or 3 hit pieces on Bitcoin still. So they still don't get it. And I don't think they ever will, because they don't think the world is a clown. They don't think the institution's a clown world. They don't understand that yet. They think the New York Times is what is the tagline on the New York Times? All the things worth
Democracy dies in the dark.
Ludicrous, right? So they still believe that. They unironically believe that. They believe themselves. They believe in the Washington and and the UN and all of that. And so of course they wouldn't like. To me, the Bitcoiner is someone who just feels despair at the crumbling institutions around them, and it's almost this desperate jump. Like it's like someone in a burning building. It's like, well, you jump from the 4th story and probably break your legs. Who knows? Or maybe you'll bounce on something down below. But if you stay here, you're going to die. So I almost see Bitcoin as like that. And so I think the only people who are going to get it are going to be some people who just dissatisfied, for whatever reason, like they're disagreeable people by nature, or for whatever reason they've got a chip on their shoulder and they just don't get along with the.
It's interesting you mention that, though, because I almost have the opposite experience, which is that the cynical and I think cynicism, just generally as we see it, is such a disease. This kind of meh. Kind of, I don't care, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And so I would expect the most cynicism of clown world to come from legacy institutions, and it kind of does in a surface sense. It's, Biden's doing this, it's terrible, or Trump's doing that, it's terrible. But it isn't critical of a deeper level of organization. And on the other hand, certainly my own experience is that, Bitcoin, it just kind of makes sense. And, I maybe debate, APO versus CTV or whatever, some technical thing, but I don't even debate that. I just sort of try and entertain the different realities that both those things mean. But actually, generally speaking, I'm like, yeah, this kind of works, and it's almost naive. It's almost like faith. It's like, yeah, it kind of works. It hasn't failed, and my Bitcoin's all good. Time to do something else and focus on my own work, and I just leave my Bitcoin stuff to be all good. If that sort of makes sense. Like I don't sort of stress about Bitcoin. It just works.
It makes sense, but I think you probably do have to stress about Bitcoin, like that, and that's the thing about. So I would rather just not mess around with things like APO and CTV.
Oh yeah, I mean we don't have to go there.
No, but I mean but you have to. You have to, because and MVK does a good job of articulating this. He understands, of Bitcoin Review, Cold Card. He understands the game theory and how screwed we are potentially going. I mean, in terms of keeping hold of your Bitcoin against the attacks that are coming. When you think about everything out there in terms of the AI, improvements in AI, in hackers' ability to break into your computing setup and extract a secret is only going to increase in sophistication and scale and scope that they're able to do that. And so something like covenants can help you secure your coins. You can have reactive security, right? And so probably for those who are going to keep their Bitcoin, so I'm talking maybe a decade, 2 decade, whatever the time frame, these survivors we've been talking about are going to be people who keep up to date with how to custody and implement and move their coins to like a covenant-like structure, right? So I think you do have to stress in the setting. You don't have to panic, but you have to kind of you have to understand that there's a like massive self-responsibility, and if you lose your coins because someone hacked you, guess what? That's on you. And to me, that's on you. Like
I think you're right. I may have contradicted myself there. Like I think I certainly am absolutely listening and watching and reading and studying all of this stuff, but it's not like a cynical mode of engaging with it. I'm not like, it's like, do you know the meme of Matthew McConaughey, like, and he's like smoking and his eyes are wide open and he's like, okay, what's going on? Like, it feels like that. It feels like it's a more pure, it's like, we're in the driver's seat now. There's no fucking around. It's not like, what's Biden done now? It's like, no, this is life and death. And it's almost, it's like pressure, but it's not stress. It's not cognitive. It's not like, what's going on now? Who's invaded who? Blah, blah. It's like, no, this is life or death stuff. And it almost at that level, it's like, well, you just have to accept it, and run with it. And it's like, we're running it now, baby.
Yeah, I don't have the same feeling of agency, quite the same maybe. But I've been getting into chess lately, and I've been studying the game for the last year quite intensely. I highly recommend it. Really, really entertaining game. But for me, it always feels like a very complicated chess position that, in the game of chess, you're trying to checkmate your opponent, but you've also got to prevent your opponent's attacks and ideas. And it feels like Bitcoin is like that, and it's playing out. There's a number of threats on the board. You have to really sit down and calculate and think deeply about. And if you don't, I feel like there's a sucker punch. There's a sucker punch waiting for you, because there's just so many ways this can go wrong. There's so many ways you can lose your Bitcoin, and and it doesn't mean you have to stress. You can even enjoy the process, right? It's intellectually stimulating.
Well, I mean, you play chess. I mean, I do jiu-jitsu, and
right,
it's similar.
Similar, right? Yeah.
You mess up, you're going to get choked out. You know? And if you don't tap quick enough, you're going to, break an arm or something. So, look, man, I think today we've covered some good stuff, I think. I mean, what I really like, I think of it, like sort of throwing the cards out on the table and saying, okay, well, these are all the pieces we've got. And what I like about talking with you, Dash, is I feel like you've got a real solid grounding in a lot of these areas, but it's also, you're open to just discussing what the cards are and sort of how they relate to each other. I don't think now is the time to be dogmatic. We haven't built the temples yet or anything. Yet we're seeing dogma start to emerge in Bitcoin around what is right, what is wrong, and I mean in terms of what the code should be and how that. Let me rephrase that. We're coming into a phase now where something like covenants is a talking point, and how we judge that, how we talk about that, it feels like it's starting to sort of get solidified, and the way we debate feels like it's ossifying a little bit, if you know what I mean. Like we're not making these sweeping changes like we were 5 years ago. And at the same time, with AI, you talk about the risk of AI kind of getting into your computer, but I think the real risk is that it fakes rough consensus, and it feels like there's all of the support for,
like, what do they call that, the astroturfing or something like that. So you'd get this like all these thousands of sock puppet accounts saying we need APO now.
Right? And it makes you feel like you've got there's this overwhelming imperative to do something or to change the code that you're running on your node or whatnot. And there's all of this stuff, and I mean, again, I sort of put it all into Bitcoinism, and I think just at least throwing it out there and saying, okay, these are the talking points. In the future, I hope we can pick more of these up and really dive into them. But thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Anytime. Enjoyed it.
All right, man, thank you.
Cool.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Allingham, and that was the transformation of value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.